Okay, here's a preview of coming attractions, if I may be so bold as to call them attractions. This is roughly what I'm going to try to accomplish in the paper today. First, I'm going to start off by briefly outlining the two kinds of intentions, individual intentions and we intentions, as they figure in Seller's ethical theory. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to argue that there's two kinds of reasoning that we do. There's two kinds of rationality, individual rationality and cooperative rationality, and that these two kinds of rationality actually correspond to the two kinds of intentions in Seller's ethical theory and offer us a very fruitful way of elaborating a truly Sellarsian ethics. Next, I want to make some comments about intentional inference and some elaborations on that notion. And then I want to conclude with some comments on categorical reasonableness as this features in Seller's ethics. So, as everybody knows, Sellers begins virtually all of his discussions of moral theory with a discussion of intentions and the logic of intentions. And in particular, he usually begins with a discussion of individual intentions. So, for example, it shall be the case that my children get a good education expresses my individual intention that my children get a good education. Now, as most of you probably know, Sellers is of the view, when he comes to talking about the logic of intentions, that the logic of intentions, logical relations among intentions, are parasitic on logical relations among the contents of intentions. So as Sellers says, if P implies Q, then shall P implies shall Q. Now, Sellers doesn't mean, of course, that if you intend P, that you will necessarily, in fact, intend Q. Rather, he means this to be along the lines of a rational principle, kind of like Kant's principle that if you will the end, then you also will the means. Now, to regiment the logic of intentions and to allow us to formally represent the logic of intentions, Sellers introduces shall as an operator that operates on the contents of intentions. And so we can formally represent the logic of intentions as follows. Shall P, I intend that P entails Q, therefore shall Q. All pretty straightforward so far, probably pretty familiar territory to a lot of you. Now, Sellers is of the view, of course, that this notion of individual intention doesn't capture the moral point of view. There's something essential missing about this notion of intention. And it's not necessarily the content of the individual intention that lacks the moral point of view. Because, of course, you can individually intend something altruistic. But even individual altruistic intention fails to capture the moral point of view. Because, individual altruistic intention, at best, we can have parallel individual intentions, but not shared intentions. So to move in the direction that better captures the moral point of view, Sellers wants to introduce a kind of intention that's not egocentric, but that captures the idea that when we intend from the moral point of view, we intend as members of a group. And of course, what he does is to introduce this notion of a we intention, which we can express as follows. Shall we, I do A. Of course, Sellers, when he introduces we intentions, it does we as a subscript, but I wasn't sure that would show up very well on PowerPoint, so I did it parenthetically. So I'm sacrificing accuracy for the sake of visibility, yada yada, pragmatism, whatever. Of course, two things are crucial for a we intention to express the moral point of view. The first is the scope. And Sellers says that the scope of the we must be rational beings generally. And the second deals with the content. He says that for the we intention to express the moral point of view, there must be an intrinsically reasonable we intention. And for Sellers, this is a we intention along the lines of, shall we be the case that our general welfare is maximized? As I said, I'm going to come back to this notion of categorical reasonableness toward the end of this talk. Now, as I said, what I want to argue in sort of the first, third, 40%, whatever, of this talk is that there's two kinds of rationality, individual rationality and cooperative rationality, and that this offers us a very fruitful way of elaborating a Sellarsian ethics. So let's go on ahead and get right to that. Now, many discussions of rationality start with the assumption that all rationality must be conceived of as individual agents acting on intentions with contents that might, again, at most be parallel in Seller's terminology, but cannot be shared. It's kind of puzzling, though, how you can get an account of morality out of an account of individual rationality. It seems like when we insist on understanding rationality as individual, then the ship of morality is always going to run aground on the rocks of free rider problems and the like. So to illustrate this point, think of kind of a familiar sort of example from the utilitarian literature. Think about a water conservation order that might be, people might be asked to follow during a drought. So the question that the utilitarian asks is, or that we ask the utilitarian more accurately, is should I obey the water conservation order in time of a drought? Well, a familiar and puzzling kind of answer that it seems like we have to give for the utilitarian is, no, I shouldn't obey the water conservation order. My violation of the water conservation order creates positive utility for me, and it doesn't create negative utility for anybody else, because I'm just one person, right? So, and it's not a question of people being selfishly motivated. This kind of problem even arises on a system like utilitarianism, which counsels impartial benevolence. The problem is more fundamental. The problem is asking people to reason as individuals. When people individually do that which is utility maximizing, it generates an overall result which is not utility maximizing. So the problem isn't one of selfishness or anything like that. The problem is people reasoning as individuals. What's the alternative? I mean, how are people supposed to reason if not as individuals about what they individually are supposed to do? Well, I think Seller's suggestion, we can get some guidance from Seller's suggestion, which is that essential to the moral point of view is that we intend, when we intend from the moral point of view, we intend not individually, but qua members of the larger moral community. And this suggests that there's not just a fundamental logical difference between individual intention and moral intention, we intention, but there's also a fundamental logical difference between reasoning individually and reasoning morally, reasoning as part of a group. When I reason morally, I'm not just reasoning about what I should do in a particular case. Rather, as Sellers would put it, I'm reasoning about the consequences of anybody acting in a certain way, in a certain kind of circumstances. Now, the idea that there's a notion of cooperative rationality, which is not reducible to individual rationality, has been advanced by various thinkers, Margaret Gilbert, Robert Sugden, and people like that. Now, I think we can show that there's a viable notion of cooperative rationality if we can give an example where rationality can only be construed cooperatively and not individually. And I think Robert Sugden gives us a kind of example with what he calls the footballer's problem. Of course, he's talking about soccer, but whatever. Now, in the footballer's problem, we're to imagine that you have two players who are trying to score on the opposing team. Each of them has two options. Player A can pass the ball left or right, and player B can run left or right to receive the ball. Each of them has to decide independently what to do. There's no time for communication. We're further to suppose that if both players choose left, if player A passes left and player B runs left, they have some chance of scoring, 10%. But if they both choose right, they have a somewhat better chance of scoring. But of course, if one chooses left and the other right, then they have no chance of scoring at all. Here's the question: what should they do? I think it's manifestly obvious what they should do, right? They should both go right. Of course, the problem is that this extremely obvious solution cannot be derived from individual rationality as it's construed in ordinary game theory for the following reason. In game theory, if you want to know what it's rational for player A to do, well, player A should go right if he thinks it's rational for player B to go right. But of course, player B is in exactly the same boat, right? Player B should go right if he thinks it's rational for A to go right. So you wind up with the answer that player A should go right if it's rational for player A to go right. That's no kind of answer at all, right? You have this Ouroboros of reasoning, which gives us no solution to what actually people should do. Now, the solution to the answer is, of course, patently obvious. They should both go right. But of course, this is a solution that A and B can only achieve by thinking about what the team should do, what both of them should do. It's not something that they can conclude by thinking separately about what A should do and what B should do. So it seems like we have an example where rationality can only be construed as cooperative and not individual. Now, what I want to do, as I've already suggested, is I want to suggest that these two kinds of reasoning correspond to the two kinds of intention in Seller's ethical theory, and that we can fruitfully elaborate Seller's ethical theory in types of these two types of rationality. Consider the following. Individual intention, as Sellers points out, is inherently I-centered. It's inherently egocentric, is one of the words that Sellers uses. People can have parallel intentions, but they can't have shared intentions, individual intentions, right? But of course, individual rationality is similarly I-centered. When I reason individually, I'm reasoning about what I should do. And of course, that's the only thing that I can reason about individually, is about what I should do. And it's this egocentric perspective on rationality that misses something crucial about the moral point of view. Its inherently communal nature. So for example, as we saw, it's difficult to see from the perspective of individual rationality why I should obey a water conservation order. My conservation of water doesn't benefit me, but worse, it doesn't benefit anybody else either. So it can't be justified from the point of altruism either. But of course, it's this communal perspective that we intentions were introduced to capture. When one we intends, one intends not merely as an individual, but as a member of the larger community, as a member of a larger group. And of course, it's precisely this sort of group intention that should issue from an exercise of cooperative rationality. So if we have a general shared intention, such as that the general welfare be maximized, it follows that it's rational for us to conserve water. That is, it's rational, collectively rational, for each of us to adopt the following intention: we conserve water. Now, many people might be suspicious of the notion of cooperative rationality. Many people, in fact, are suspicious of this notion of cooperative rationality. I don't have time to say a whole lot in defense of this, but let me make a couple of brief comments. I think we can draw a couple of lessons from the preceding discussion. First, the footballer's problem demonstrates one thing, at least. It demonstrates that cooperative rationality is not reducible to individual rationality for the following reason. There was an extremely obvious solution to the footballer's problem, but it was a solution that could only be derived by thinking cooperatively, by thinking about what the team should do. And this was a solution that could not be derived by thinking about what A should do and what B should do. So it was a solution that could be derived cooperatively, but not individually. So cooperative rationality is not reducible to individual rationality. So that's the first thing that I think that the above examples have shown. Second, and this is related to the first point, cooperative rationality is often superior to individual rationality. Again, in the footballer's problem, this offered us a decision problem where the solution to the problem was manifestly obvious. It was obvious that both players should go right. But again, this was a solution that could not be derived from the perspective of individual rationality. Only cooperative rationality could give us this fundamentally obvious answer to this decision problem. Not surprisingly, cooperative rationality is particularly well suited to account for sort of communal practices like morality. So for example, in our water conservation example, cooperative rationality can explain why it's rational for us to conserve water, for us to adopt the intention, we conserve water, for the simple reason that our cooperation serves our mutual benefit. Now, these two types of rationality, individual rationality and cooperative rationality, can be wedded without difficulty, not only to Seller's account of intentional operators, but also to his account of intentional inference. But before I talk about how our notion of cooperative rationality can be wedded to the account of inference with we intentions, I want to make a brief, but I think important detour. This is something that's going to come back to be important soon. If I had a quibble with Sellers' account of inference among intensions, it would be that he sometimes seems to treat inference among the contents of intentions as though it were just an ordinary case of logical entailment, sort of formal logical entailment, rather than what it actually is, which is kind of a special case of practical inference. So for example, when Sellers introduces the notion of the logic of intentions, of inference among intentions, he says, as we've already said, shall P entails shall Q, just in case P entails Q. Now, I think that this very simple account of the logic of intentions has the potential to mislead us. And we're much more easily misled, I think, because of the kinds of examples that are used to illustrate the logic of intentions. So, for example, in the kinds of examples that Sellers uses, oftentimes the performance of Q is a necessary condition on the performance of P. So P really does just straightforwardly entail Q, which I think encourages a very simple reading of the logic of intentions, when actually the logic of intentions is nowhere near that simple. So here's an example that Sellers uses. If Jones wants to shoot people quietly, then he would have to use a silencer. Well, plausibly, using a silencer is a necessary condition on shooting people quietly, so plausibly, shall I shoot people quietly really does just entail shall I use a silencer. I think some commentators on Sellers have also sort of encouraged this kind of overly simple reading, not unwittingly encouraged this kind of overly simplistic reading of the logic of intentions in the kind of examples they use. So for example, David Solomon in his commentary on Sellers' ethics uses as examples of the contents of intentions, Jones will take all the boxes to the station, Jones will take this box to the station. Well, obviously the first just directly logically entails the second one. So this encourages a very simple reading of the logic of intentions. Unfortunately, with most cases of intentional inference, inferential relations among the contents of intentions is seldom so straightforward. So for example, I eat dinner does not in any straightforward way entail I make quiche Lorraine, or I make a cheese sandwich, or I get Chinese takeout from Royal China. The problem, of course, is that, as they say, there's more than one way to skin a cat. There are often multiple means of achieving a particular end. And so practical reasoning is almost never a matter of just strict entailment from end to means. It's usually often a way of finding a valid path from end to some means of satisfying them and some appropriate means of satisfying that end given various constraints that are in play. So for example, an agent might be hungry and form the intention, shall I eat dinner? Now remember, again, for Sellers, inferential relations among intentions are parasitic on inferential relations among the contents of intentions. Of course, I eat dinner, again, no way straightforwardly just logically entails, say, I get Chinese takeout from Royal China. But of course, formally valid inference was never the kind of inference that Sellers was most interested in the first place, was it? Of course, for him, materially valid inference was always prior in the order of explanation. To kind of illustrate this point, I'm going to refer back to, of course, an example that Brandom gives in articulating reasons, although this is, of course, a discussion he has in several different places. Brandom urges us to consider a practical inference like this to be a materially valid inference and not an enthymeme or an otherwise truncated or disguised formally valid inference. This is something we're going to come back to a little bit later. Likewise, I think we should regard this kind of inference as also a materially valid inference, although obviously one whose validity is much more restricted to a specific set of circumstances, much more hedged in with ceteris paribus clauses, and much more easily subject to defeat. It's a materially valid practical inference because it starts from an end and infers a satisfactory means of achieving this end. Now, one final quick note. In saying that material inference is enthymetic, of course, it doesn't mean that it's always immediate. Now, I think Brandom's example is an example of an immediate inference. But of course, often our reasoning takes the form of chains of inferences. So I might reason as follows. it's raining, therefore the streets are wet, therefore I'll take my car, not my motorcycle, which has poor traction when the streets are wet. So this is the chain of material inferences. The first link in the chain is theoretical, the second one is practical, and I imagine that much of our reasoning displays this kind of pattern. It's a chain of inferences with some of the links being theoretical, some of them being practical. So again, when you say that, when I say that practical reasoning is a form of material inference, and this is not mimetic, that doesn't mean that practical reasoning must always be, of course, immediate, rather than involving some kind of chain of inferences. I'm not going to say any more about the logic of individual intentions. What I want to do now is instead show how the account of cooperative rationality that I've offered fits nicely with Seller's account of inference involving we intentions, taking into account some of the lessons that that I've tried to illustrate here. So again, suppose that we decide that the following intention is categorically valid. It shall we be the case that our welfare is maximized. Now, as in the case of individual intention, practical reasoning involves reasoning from ends, specified as the contents of intentions, to satisfactory means of achieving these ends. So given the end in question, that our welfare be maximized, we can determine certain means of promoting or achieving this end. But of course, these means are means that we have to promote in concert as a group. So for example, our welfare is maximized will materially entail as means each of us refrains from harming others, each of us keeps our promises, etc. So we start off with sort of an intrinsically reasonable we intention. We have this intermediate step where we take the end and we infer various means of achieving that end. And of course, the final step in our practical reasoning is we then infer various derivative intentions, which we must then act upon to satisfy the formal end of morality. So therefore, shall we be each of us refrains from harming others, shall we be each of us keeps our promises, etc., etc., etc. Now, one thing I want to emphasize is that it's this intermediate step from end to means of achieving this end that this account of cooperative rationality I've offered is particularly well suited to account for. And this is for at least two reasons. First, as we noted in the case of individual intention, reasoning from end to means is almost never a case of just strict logical entailment. It's a process of starting from an end and reasoning to a means of satisfactorily achieving that end given various constraints that are in play. So for example, suppose we have an end, keep the reservoir from running dry. We have various constraints. The reservoir is critically low. We're in the middle of a drought. Practical reasoning helps us start from this end and infer a satisfactory means of achieving this end. We will all conserve water. But again, it's not a matter of straightforward entailment. There's lots of means we could use to achieve this end. We could spend millions of dollars trucking in water from some distant water-rich location. We could slaughter half the population to reduce demand. These are all means that would effectively promote this end, right? But the whole point of cooperative reasoning is that it allows us to reason to a satisfactory means that we can promote in concert, satisfying various constraints of achieving this end. So I think that's the first reason that our account of cooperative rationality is very well suited for achieving this step, this intermediate step. But there's another reason. I think there's a second reason why the account of cooperative rationality offered is very well suited for accounting for this intermediate step here from end to means, and that's the reason as follows. Cooperative rationality, as deployed from end to means of achieving this end, captures an essential feature of morality that Sellers repeatedly emphasizes. He says, members of our community, insofar as they value the general welfare, do so not from a personal point of view, external benevolence, but as one of us. We've seen already how difficult it is, I think we've seen this, from the individual point of view to justify moral principles, but the perspective of cooperative rationality supplies precisely what was missing, reasoning as a member of a group to a conclusion about what each one of us ought to do. So, wedding our account of collective rationality, to Sellers' account of reasoning with we intentions, we can reason as follows. We start off with an intrinsically valid intrinsically reasonable we intention, which expresses, as it were, the formal end of morality. Cooperative rationality suggests a means of achieving this end, but of course it's a means that we can only achieve by acting in concert as a group. And then we derive from these first two steps various derivative intentions that we must collectively adopt in order to promote this formal end of morality. Voila, I hope. Although I'm sure I'll be hearing about this at the end. Okay. Now, the last bit, categorical validity. Now, one concern you might have about the account I'm offering here is that it relies very heavily on means-end rationality in deriving these derivative intentions that we all have to adopt. And so a worry you might have is that by deriving all of these derivative moral intentions via means-end rationality, we're departing from the Kantian spirit of Sellers' project and making all moral intentions hypothetical in nature. Well, Sellers offers us a way out here. Suppose, for example, we decide that the following intention is categorically reasonable. Sellers' crucial move, which he makes in several different places, is that he argues that the reasonableness of an imperative can be both categorical and derivative. Intrinsic reasonableness is only a special case of categorical reasonableness. So, one can reason as follows. Now, there are two essential features of this argument. The first essential feature is this. If the first premise is intrinsically reasonable, and the reasoning to the conclusion is valid, then the conclusion is also categorically reasonable, though derivatively so. This is the concrete payoff of Sellers' distinction between categorical and intrinsic reasonableness. Categorical imperatives are concrete articulations of what specific intentions we must adopt in order to satisfy the formal end of morality. So that's the first feature of this argument that I think is important. The second feature of this argument that's worth mentioning is that this second premise here, each of us doing A, I, and CI, blah, 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 necessarily involves, I argue, cooperative rationality. It involves the thought that some goal, namely our collective welfare, is promoted by some instance of collective rationality, of collective action, sorry. This step in the process, this step of reasoning cannot be replaced by individual rationality for the kinds of reasons that I have been talking about earlier. Now, combining these two observations, we can conclude that moral intentions, like this one, or like I shall, we conserve water, are categorically reasonable, though derivatively so, but are also intentions that can only be derived via cooperative rationality from intrinsically reasonable we intentions. That's the conclusion that I draw at this point. So it seems clear that in principle, at least, using means-end rationality to derive these derivative moral intentions is compatible with their being categorically reasonable, provided, of course, that they're derived from intrinsically reasonable we intentions. But it seems like now we're brought face to face with a question that we can no longer avoid. Are there, in fact, any intrinsically reasonable we intentions? You were waiting for this one, weren't you? Well, I have time for some brief comments here. I'm going to use the old Fermat's I have a proof but the margin is too small strategy. Here I'm going to appeal for help from John McDowell. John McDowell, in his writings on the categorical authority of moral imperatives, he's responding, as many of you probably know, to Philippa Foot. Philippa Foot argues famously, or infamously maybe, I'm not sure, that moral requirements are only hypothetical in nature because one can, without irrationality, fail to see that one has reason to act on a moral imperative. Now, McDowell agrees with her this far. He says, one need not manifest irrationality in failing to see that one has reason to act as morality requires, but, important caveat, he thinks that there is another sense in which moral requirements have categorical force. I'm going to get there in sort of a roundabout way, though. He starts by noting that it's empty, or at best a placeholder, to say that you have reason to do A because you should do A. Rather, he says, and I quote, the reason one has to do something must involve some appropriate specific consideration which could in principle be cited in support of the should statement. Now, on the Kantian consideration, these relevant considerations will be features of the certain situations as conceived by the virtuous agent. Now, crucially, in explaining why the virtuous agent acts as she does, we don't need to attribute to her a desire. We don't need to attribute a desire to her to explain why she acts as she does. Why not? Well, once again, as promised, we can appeal to Brandom to explain why McDowell thinks as he does, I think. Consider the following theoretical inference. Now, Brandom urges us to consider this to be a materially valid inference and argues that the impulse to see this inference as enthymetic results from formalist impulses which should have been laid to rest over 100 years ago by Lewis Carroll. He doesn't put it, I don't think, quite that rudely. Whatever. Moving on. But a similar move can be made in practical reasoning, right? It is raining, therefore I shall take an umbrella should also, for exactly the same kinds of reasons, be regarded as a materially valid inference. The fact that this inference is subject to defeat in no way entails that it's an enthymeme. The impulse to argue that this is a good inference only with the insertion of a minor premise to the effect that I desire to stay dry results from the same formalist prejudices which pushed us in the direction of claiming that only deductively valid theoretical inferences can be good theoretical inferences, and it should be resisted for exactly the same kinds of reasons. Now, on McDowell's view, there's no harm in attributing a desire to someone who acts in such and such a way, but it does no explanatory work. This person's understanding that it's raining explains all by itself why she takes an umbrella. Or to take a moral example, the virtuous agent's understanding that a bully is beating up some vulnerable child on the playground explains why she intervenes. Attributing to her a desire to, protect the vulnerable doesn't add anything to our understanding of why she does what she does. Now, another thing I noticed about the Solomon article, his sort of elaboration of Sellers' ethics, is that he said that one thing that exercised metaethicists in the mid-20th century, and you can see that nothing's changed, is how to reconcile the cognitive and motivational aspects of moral judgments. And of course, underlying this tension is, of course, just the assumption that, well, it's not an assumption, but the belief that the Humean theory of action has to be the right one, right? And I think one of the advantages of this sort of Kantian view of things is that it helps see precisely how the cognitive and motivational aspects of moral judgments can be reconciled. Obviously, I'm not claiming this insight. McDowell is the one who intervenes in the literature on moral motivation in this very powerful way and explains how it is that we can have this kind of moral judgment that is at the same time motivating without having to attribute a desire, without having to revert to a Humean theory of motivation. But I think the fundamental tools for doing this lie with this notion of material inference that Sellers originally provides for us. So again, I think this is another way in which Sellarsian ethics fruitfully contributes to contemporary desires, as we see in McDowell's article and as we see in sort of Brandom's elaboration of practical inference, the Kantian notion of practical inference here. Okay, moving along. So given the above discussion, it's tempting to say, I guess, that moral imperatives are categorical in this sense. Their binding force is not contingent on the presence of a desire. But McDowell's view, McDowell says that, of course, prudential imperatives are binding in exactly the same sense. And I suppose nobody wants to say that prudential imperatives have categorical force, I guess, I don't know. So But for McDowell, there's another sense in which moral imperatives have categorical force, and it's this. If a virtuous agent's conception of the situation genuinely imposes a moral requirement on her, competing considerations are not just outweighed, they're silenced. Now, Sellers never states things quite so strongly, or at least not so clearly, but here's what he does say. In On Knowing the Better and Doing the Worse, here's Sellers' diagnosis of weakness of the will. He says that sometimes the conclusively good reason, the moral reason, doesn't turn out to be the conclusively strong reason, the motivating reason. The implication of this discussion is that the moral reason is always the conclusively good reason. Well, so I think we have to conclude from this discussion from Sellers and McDowell that on a McDowellian or Sellarsian account, depending on how strong you want to go, moral imperatives are categorical in the following sense, that they either outweigh or silence competing considerations. I suspect this is not what you wanted to be shown. You wanted to be shown something more. You wanted to be shown that moral requirements are, in fact, somehow mandatory, that they're not optional, right? You wanted to be shown that we have to adopt the moral point of view. This is what you're waiting for, right? Sorry to disappoint. I mean, are there conclusive reasons to adopt the moral point of view? McDowell, for one, regards this whole question as actually confused. He says, and I will quote, "The question, why should I conform to the dictates of morality, is most naturally understood as asking for an extra moral motivation which will be gratified by virtuous behavior. So understood, the question has no answer. What may happen is that someone is brought to see things as the virtuous person does, and so stops feeling the need to ask it." Sellers, too, seems to think that the moral point of view, once adopted, gives you conclusive reasons to act, but that you can't be given conclusive reasons for adopting the moral point of view. In fact, Sellers seems to regard the choice between the personal point of view, pursuing your own happiness through I intentions, and the moral point of view, pursuing the collective welfare through we intentions, as though it were a choice among incommensurable options. And in fact, at the end of On Knowing the Better and Doing the Worse, Sellers identifies two, all things considered, coherent motives from which one may act. First, the welfare of our community viewed as related to the actions of each of us, interpersonal benevolence. Notice he says each of us, again, here's this emphasis on we intentions and I would argue cooperative rationality. Second, one's own happiness or well-being viewed from a personal point of view as one's own happiness or well-being, in traditional terms, self-love. And he concludes that article with this observation about the conflict between these two motives. I was actually worried you were going to steal my thunder here, Jim, in your paper. He says, "The choice is, in an important sense, between incommensurables. Which choice one makes is a revelation of what one at that moment is. It is often surprising, sometimes exhilarating or disconcerting, even devastating, but always a revelation." Now, the above has really only been a sketch, a sketchiest of sketches, of some ways in which we can elaborate Sellers' ethics in what I hope are various fruitful ways. But what I want to emphasize is that I think that this elaboration of Sellers' ethics keeps Sellers firmly within the Kantian tradition, which I think is something that's important to do in elaborating Sellers' ethics. And I think it does this in at least three ways. First, we've explained, with help from McDowell, I think the sense in which moral reasons or moral imperatives are categorically reasonable. Second, using Sellers' distinction between intrinsic and categorical reasonableness, we've shown that even though we employ means-end reasoning as a tool of moral reasoning, derivative moral principles and these derivative moral intentions are still categorically reasonable. And finally, we've tightened the connection between Sellarsian categorical imperatives and Kantian universalizability. In reasoning cooperatively, we are essentially following Sellers' dictum that moral principles primarily concern the consequences of anybody acting in a certain way in a certain kinds of circumstances. So for example, the moral intention, we conserve water, essentially follows as a consequence of reasoning, not from the individual point of view, but cooperatively from the intersubjective standpoint about the consequences of each of us conserving or not conserving water given the certain current circumstances. Now, much more can and should be said about Sellers' ethics. It's a curiously and sadly neglected aspect of his philosophy, but hopefully these few comments will contribute in some very small way to renewed interest in the subject. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to go with Kevin.
Thank you, Jeremy. Really enjoyed that. So I want to go back to the example of the footballer's problem and see how this helps to understand Sellers, and maybe it can explain what my problem is.
Okay.
So, because I actually don't know a whole lot about Sellers' ethics. You're right. I don't think it's talked about enough.
Yeah.
Okay. So when we were talking about the problem, it seemed like it was something they should do to go right. Right? However, it seems like that's not something that it's possible for these players to ever really know. Right? You said part of the setup was they didn't have enough time to converse or talk about this, deliberate together.
Decide independently.
Right, yeah. So somehow it's something they ought to do, but I wasn't quite able to see how this notion of we intentions or communal reasoning was going to be able to help them at all to be able to recognize that fact. And an analogous problem then would arise in the other cases in terms of, right, if we're committed to, maximizing the overall welfare, being able to communally reason together in this, that doing one particular thing is going to be the thing that maximizes the overall welfare. I think there's an analogous problem. If we can't know in the one case, maybe we can't know in the other case, and that would be a problem.
Yeah. Okay, well, here's how I think the footballer's problem works. Is that if you look at the outcome matrix, the decision matrix here, you can see that if the two players go right, they have a better chance of scoring.
Right.
Right. So, what you can conclude from this is that if they go right, they have a better chance of scoring. So they should go right. So if A and B are considering the question like this, they can say, okay, we should go right. But the problem is that from the standpoint of individual rationality, A can't reason to A going right, and B can't reason to B going right. A can look at this and say, yeah, we should go right. But
so the matrix is somehow available to them. Like,
well,
this is information they have. Because I wasn't clear.
But
about that.
I think obviously, like, the exact percentages aren't available to them. But I think you have to think this is a formalization of a kind of decision that soccer players would make. They can see that maybe they have a little more space on the right side.
Okay.
Maybe the defender on the right side, the left back is a little bit weaker. That kind of thing, right? So they can say, look, clearly we should go right. But again, that's a decision that the two of them, have to make. This is something we should do, right?
All right. Well then.
Because the basic intuition is this, is that B's action makes no sense independently of what A is doing. Right, so it doesn't make any sense to say A should, it doesn't make any sense for A to say, it's rational for me to go right. It's only rational for A to go right if B goes right, right? So the whole point is that it doesn't make sense for one of them to do something in the absence of also thinking about what the other one is doing.
Right.
They can only think about both doing it at the same time. And that's the essential problem, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense for A to think about what I'm going to do. They have to think about what they're both going to do.
Right. And if I could just quickly add a worry about the comparison with McDowell, because it seems like Sellers' we intentions are connected with means and reasoning in a way that doesn't seem to be the kind of thing McDowell's talking about and insisting that there really are categorical imperatives. So this was a kind of a disanalogy that I thought got kind of glossed over, right? When, what Sellers is, the we intentions have to do with interpersonal benevolence, right? But McDowell seems to just be talking about, he talks about just coming to see matters aright. Right? That's all it's about.
Yeah.
It's not embracing some
You're right.
means
And
end
I
reasoning.
think, I think you're probably right about that. I think there are analogies to be drawn between the two, but there's obviously fundamental disanalogies. So I probably, I need to be more careful about the ways in which I analogize the two.
Thank you, Jeremy. You made an analogy in your talk between the debate, on the one hand, between the sort of material inference person and the formalist, the one who insists that inferences must be formal to be good, formally good to be good, formally valid, on the one hand, and the Humean and the Kantian on the other hand. And the thought, I take it, was that, well, if you've gone material inference, if you've rejected formalism on the side of belief, then when we move from theoretical reasoning to practical reasoning, we should also reject the Humean line and the Kantians. Okay, so I want to challenge that. I want to make a plea on behalf of the Humean, and not because I'm a formalist, because on the theoretical side, I think that's exactly right. You have to have material inferences; those are the ground of semantic content and all that. So I'm no friend of formalism, but I think that the analogy is not a good one, and I think that you can perfectly well accept material inferences on the theoretical side and not go the route that you were suggesting on the Kantian side.
Okay.
So here's what I would recommend on the side of practical reasoning. It's not that we go from it's raining to shall I take my umbrella, right? Sorry, it's not that what needs to be added isn't a self-ascription of a desire. I want to, that. That's not what I would suggest. And if that's what Hume is suggesting we need to add, then I reject that as well. What I suggest that we add is not get wet with a either shall operator or a want operator, which isn't a self-ascription, it's just the having of the desire there. I think the having of the desire, as opposed to the self-ascription of the desire, needs to be there in order for the thing to go through. Why do I think that? And I think, by the way, that would still be a material inference. That wouldn't be a formally good inference. So, it's raining, want not to get wet, shall take umbrella. That's not a formally good inference at all, or in any sense of that word. I think it's still materially good inference, but it requires the having of the desire there. And I think that when you move to the theoretical, if we look at the theoretical side, we don't ever actually move from it's raining to the streets will be wet. What we move from is an entire web of belief taken at a time slice to another entire web of belief taken at another time slice. So, I mean, we represent inferences with these sentences, one sentence following another, but that's not, maybe that's how we're conscious of ourselves as thinking. Maybe that's why we represent it that way. Or maybe that the reason we're conscious of ourselves thinking that way is because we represent it that way on screens. Whatever the story goes there, that's not what's really happening. What's really happening is you're moving from a huge set of beliefs, huge web of beliefs, to another one in a materially good way, not in a formally good way, right? When we move to the theoretical side, to the practical side, you have to take into account more than just the web of beliefs. You have to take into account the web of, well, intentions and desires and so on. And if you didn't have, on the theoretical side, a certain kind of belief to the effect that nothing is weird is going on with the streets, like, for example, imagine in some environments the streets sort of soak up the water, so even if it rains, they're not wet. If you didn't have a belief that ruled that sort of thing out, that said nothing weird is going on, right? You wouldn't get the conclusion that the streets will be wet. On the practical side, if you didn't have the desire not to get wet, for example, if you had the desire to go singing in the rain, right, you wouldn't grab that umbrella, right? That's just a psychological fact about people. If they don't have certain desires, they will not output certain actions, and if they do have the certain desires, then they will. So I think that we can reject formalism, but if we have a clear view on what either or both theoretical and practical reasoning is, we will see that you need the extra beliefs on the side of the material inference, not to make it formally good, just extra beliefs, and the extra attitudes on the side of practical inference, the desires that need to be there in order for the behavior to actually occur. So.
Well, I mean, I think that, I think that, someone wanting to go singing in the rain serves as, a weird thing going on in an analogous sense that, something weird going on the street serves as something weird going on in the theoretical side. I mean, I think they both serve as defeaters. But again, I mean, I think the whole point is that the fact that, defeaters are possible, and the fact that these inferences are non-monotonic doesn't mean that there has to be some kind of minor premise there in the first place.
So this is a follow-up to Kevin's question. I wasn't entirely convinced that individual rationality can't handle the footballer's problem. So in single-player decision cases or single-player games, there are decision theories that make available to the agent, before she's made her decisions, credences about what action she'll perform. So player, and I could imagine that being extended to this case, which has two players. You could have player A having credences that player A will go left and that player A will go right. Credences, and A can also have credences that B will go left or B will go right. And it seemed like the reason you were saying that individual rationality wasn't going to be able to handle this is because you can't have player A deciding what to do in a vacuum, unaware of what B is going to do. But these kinds of decision theories or game theories would attempt to account for that. And I wouldn't say that I think you might agree that that doesn't look like collective rationality still. But so it would seem like individual rationality can handle this. A natural thing to do would you could give, since you don't know what player B is going to do, you could just give player B, give yourself a credence, 0.5 on either side for player B's action, and then since right has a greater value collectively than left, it's going to come out when you account for credences that each player will individually decide to go right.
But the question is, why does right have a greater credence, though? Because if both of them go right...
It doesn't need to have a greater credence. You could give 0.5 credences, but since right has a greater value or greater reward, going right will have greater expected utility.
Well, I'd like an explanation of why it has greater credence. I mean, so, if A is trying to think, okay, so what's B going to do? B is going to, if he's going to assign a greater credence to B going right. And why does he do that? He thinks because
he doesn't have to do that.
Because it's a team sport. Why? Philosophers don't play team sports, apparently. Because you're a team, you know what the other person is going to do. You know he can't kick a goal with his left foot, so you got to go right so he can going to kick a goal with his left foot. That's what it means to be a team sport. So this kind of like there's 50% chance of this and 50% chance. That's never going on in a team sport. You know your team members, you know what their propensities are, and you play to their strengths. The end. So it just seems so frustrating to me to kind of go like, and then we have this thing where it's 50%. When you're playing a team, you know your teammates, you know their strengths, and you play towards their strengths. It's never 50-50. It seems to me this whole kind of football scenario is like, wow. It's just, that's not how it happens in real life. In real life, that's why you practice.
All right, we're a little out of order here, so...
I was trying to help them with saying, you could have this individual credence because you have this neural network, you've got this whole set of stuff that you're already adding into because you know your players, and so it doesn't kind of come out like this, you could have an individual thing.
But the whole
because
point is
you
that,
know your
but
teammate.
I think you put your finger on it exactly. It's a
Okay.
team sport, right? You know, why does the football player run this route? It doesn't make any sense independently of what the quarterback is planning to do, right? It's each of their strategies is interdependent in a fundamental way that it doesn't make sense for one of them to do X independently of the other one doing Y. You can't explain why it makes sense for this guy to do X independently of your explanation of why it makes sense for this guy to do Y.
But if you move to football, it's because they have set plays in a way that the soccer guy doesn't have a set play.
But I think.
We
I
have a
think the
follow-up
analysis
from the
extends
person
that.
who actually has the floor.
So-
I think you
so-
can do the individual.
Yeah, and in a real game, you would have credences, you would have reasons to favor one prediction of what another player is going to do over another. But given that there is an asymmetry in how the values of the results are distributed, you don't need to have one or other of the predictions privileged in terms of your credence about it. You could have A could have an equal credence for B's actions, but you still get that each player goes right.
So if A assigns an equal credence, like 50-50 to A running,
Yeah. And
because
you
the
could
expected
just
utility is higher with right.
imagine that A assigns a little higher credence to B going right, just because it is a slightly greater value. But even if you don't.
But I still want to know why the expected utility of B, of A
Oh.
going right is higher,
Oh,
independently
that
of,
might require paper and pencil,
yeah,
but
yeah, and I still think you can't give an answer to that independently of it being rational for them both to go right.
I could try to do that later.
Okay.
Beth. Just to challenge you. I don't have a class with her, so it's okay. That I agree with you that in a team that's been playing together for 2, 3, 20 years, they know each other. But that's not, well, sometimes, yeah. Yeah. Like Donovan, he's been playing for like, okay. Just saying. All right, but there's a lot of situations when you're playing with people that you're playing with for the first time, or the people they're not very familiar with. Gym class is a great example. Or if you're just doing a pickup game with people you've never played with before. And so in that sense, you would not have a knowledge of the person's personality, their skill set. It might literally be the first time you're playing with them, and it might be the first time you're going for a goal with that particular person. And so I don't think that personal knowledge of the players is always going to apply. And so there is something more at the root where if you don't have more knowledge happening, if you really are torn between two decisions, this could be enough to bump you over to make one decision. So I was just going to say that. Back here.
Hi, I'm very friendly to this approach, and I like this sketchy sketch, and I wonder if one place you might fill in a little bit more. It might be in tension with the account, but maybe just needs a little bit extra. A meta-ethical theory might want to give some account of the supererogatory, and it seems, at least at first glance, that there might be a problem here because the conception of the concept of the supererogatory is a moral concept, but it's one where we recognize moral reasons and our personal intentions are not silenced.
Right.
They're relevant. So I wonder if you, this might be asking a lot on the spot, but I just wonder if you have some idea of like what Sellers or what you might say about why there is that concept as a moral concept.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually really a good question. You know, I think probably, here's what if I had to answer on the spur of the moment, here's what I would have to say. You know, I think that I think once you have an account of cooperative rationality, I think an account of supererogation would fall out of it pretty naturally, right? Because if you have an account of cooperative rationality, what the account of cooperative rationality bids you do is to find a sort of an optimal strategy for promoting the formal end of morality, right? So, so then supererogation would then be defined as doing anything more stringent than that optimal strategy would call for. I can see that you're dissatisfied by this answer.
Well, it seems like if the formal end is something vaguely utilitarian about optimizing welfare, then the supererogatory wouldn't be more than what would be called for, right? It would be just what is. It seems like you would just do away with the supererogatory. I thought you were about to say something kind of social contract theoretic about the supererogatory. Well, I won't stop.
Yeah. Well, and I think that there's a sense in which I think we have to take seriously the idea that, when Sellers says he wants to reconcile the Kantian and teleological notions, that, if you're an act utilitarian, there's no such thing as supererogation. That's true. But, for Sellers, when you have these sorts of when Sellers asks you to think about the consequences of anyone doing, A, I, and CI, what he's basically doing is taking the Kantian universalizability principle and sort of transferring it into a teleological mode, right? So what falls out of that is, I think, a series of rules, and if you have a series of rules, which we collectively act on to promote the general welfare, then you're not on each individual case doing like a utility maximizing action, because I think there are good reasons to think that that utility maximization is achieved by following rules and not performing individual actions. I have a longer story about this, but it's a longer story, right? And then so since supererogation would then be sort of deviating from that rule in a way that represents a more stringent action toward the maximization of the overall welfare. But like I said, this is actually a good question. This is something that would have to be, in a further elaboration of this account, that would be something that would have to go in there. Okay, thanks.
All right, Deborah.
Hello. Not a Slarsian. Who is the we? What makes them that way? Who is included? Who is excluded, and why?
Well, Sellers. Like I said at the very beginning, Sellers says that the we is rational beings generally. But when he says this, I really think that he intends this to be aspirational, because he understands that for most moral communities, the we is not rational beings generally. It's Christians or white people or whatever, right? It's and I think this is exactly one of Sellers's sort of moral sort of meta-moral imperatives is that to sort of expand the scope of the we until it does eventually encompass rational beings generally, because again this is the very Kantian idea that what it is to be a moral agent is to have this kind of rational autonomy. And not, it's not identified based on some contingent feature of our sort of heteronymous beings.
Do you find that satisfactory?
I don't have a better account. Does that?
Thank you for taking my question. My question was very eerily similar to her question. So, when we speak of collective rationality, I was going to ask who is the we in the we? But couldn't we find possible counterexamples where the rational and even the morally permissible course of action is the one that contradicts the maximization of the welfare of all of humanity? For instance, immigration is I know it's getting a little too first order, but immigration is a very hot button issue, and low-skilled workers typically vote against immigration because immigration does harm low-skilled workers, but the overall net benefit to humanity, to the workers, the immigrating workers, is larger than the losses to the native workers. But I think we still intuitively view their opposition to immigration as blameless, because they're not just, it's not just, I guess, bigotry against immigrants. They're trying to provide for their family, and they're trying to keep their own families out of poverty, even though the material benefits to the immigrants exceed the material losses to native workers. Couldn't examples like these, I guess, undermine the notion that we always should reason, I guess, to maximize the general welfare, whatever that is.
Okay, well, I mean, here's what I'll say. I mean, I think there's a lot to say about that example. I mean, Sellers is perfectly clear that you can have a we intention with any sort of arbitrary scope. I mean, you can have a we intention, that encompasses, members of, the Save the Whooping Crane Society, or whatever is the example that he uses. You could have a we intention that expresses, members of the working class, or members of, this particular, union or something, right? But Sellers says that's not anymore necessarily a moral intention now, right? So, I think he would say, okay, sure, if a member of, a low-skilled worker, votes on this, with the thought that, I want to save, my job, or even more broadly, the jobs of, me and my fellow low-skilled workers, I think what Sellers is going to say is maybe he's acting on a we intention, but that's not necessarily a moral we intention. But here you have, again, it's not that he's, and when you say that he's blameless, what you're offering is you're saying that it's an excused non-moral action. But, here, again, you run up against this, what we ended with was the idea that, there's this incommensurability between moral reasons and non-moral reasons, and he doesn't offer us any guidance for how to weigh them or how to choose between them. Yeah, sure, this guy, it's understandable why he votes the way he does, and we can't blame this guy for doing it, but that's not the same as saying that he's acting on a moral we intention, I don't think.
All right, this is going to have to be the last one. I'll give it to David.
It's a kind of a follow-up to this last question. I guess if you carve up your groups in funny ways, okay, so morality may not be relevant, but there is some sort of thought that one owes more to one's family in a distinctively moral way than one owes to people in New Zealand if one's family isn't in New Zealand, and so forth. That there are relevant, I don't know, some people speak of circles.
Right.
And I took part of the upshot of the question. I don't know whether this is what you intended, but that was what I heard in the question to be. You would say that not only would you save morality by taking account of these different we's,
Right.
but in a way, if you didn't take account of these different we's, if you followed Kant with this universality stuff, you wouldn't preserve morality.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it depends on how far you want to follow Sellers down the teleological line. Of course, this, I think the standard teleologist answer to this is, well, of course, you actually promote the general welfare best by, attending to local needs rather than global needs, blah, blah, blah. Again, another dissatisfied customer. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, again, you're right. I mean,
the Koch brothers family, I'm sure they take care of themselves.
yeah.
General
Well,
welfare?
but again, I mean, obviously, there's limits to that, right? Of course, because I mean, if all you care about is family to the detriment of everything else, because again, at the end of the day, he is a Kantian, right? But he, again, and that's something he doesn't, as far as I know, offer any guidance on. But
Right. I'm sorry, but we're actually going to have to end it there. We're already over time, but thank you very much, Jeremy. And we'll take about 4 minutes break here.